Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you are enjoying your Saturday. And this is the sixth and concluding part of our nominally titled Aviation in the Pacific Week. Although today, this show, we actually will be talking about island hopping. It was an excuse to talk to someone I like talking to. John McManus is making his seventh appearance on World War II TV, which is getting up there as kind of record guest. His second volume of his trilogy about the Pacific, specifically the US Army in the Pacific, has just come out fairly recently. Island Infernos. I am about a quarter of a way in and absolutely loving it, as did people like James Holland and Richard Overy and other many people. It is getting rave reviews out there. And we're going to look at the island hopping campaign. We'll talk about aviation a little bit, sources, historiography, and some other things there. So without further ado, I will just invite him in. So good afternoon, John. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back 7 times. If it's a marriage, this is the 7-year itch now, isn't it? This is where it all goes wrong, and we end up.
We get past the 7-year itch and then do well with it. I just appreciate you putting up with me this frequently.
Well, we love what you say, and so it's fair to say that the Pacific campaign has often been viewed through the eyes of the U.S. Marine Corps. That's the movie narrative, a lot of the books, the best-selling books. I had Henry Sledge on, of course, Son of Eugene, a few weeks ago. And the Army, at first glance, if you've followed that U.S. Marine Corps lens, seems to be a lesser role. Of course, it isn't, because you're just in the middle of a trilogy of 3 books of 600 pages each. So before we get into the detail, why is it important to tell the story of the U.S. Army in the Pacific theater?
Yeah, so what I've hoped to do is not denigrate the Marine Corps, quite the opposite, because, the more deeper you get into this, the more you see, how brilliantly the Marines did perform and the valor is off the charts. But you also get a sense of how few of them there were. And so what I hope to do is kind of flip the contextual narrative that there are about 250,000 Marines mobilized in World War II, and yet the Army sends 1.8 million ground soldiers to serve in the war against Japan, somewhere in the Pacific and Asia in the course of the war. That's the third largest army the United States has ever sent overseas to fight a war, and yet there's this sense that the Marines did most of the fighting, and when actually it's really quite the opposite. And so why is it important to understand that? Of course, on its own face, because you get a better understanding of how World War II in the Pacific was actually fought. And also, by the way, the kind of logistical side that the Army was so heavily involved in, the engineering side, the medical side, all those kinds of things that the Marines really weren't designed to do. But also, one of the things that attracted me to this is that the Pacific War, especially the Army's war, I think leaves us many more harbingers for what's going to happen ever since. The way the war was fought is so much more typical of what's happened since in Korea and Vietnam, in the 21st century wars, in terms of the brutality and the savagery of the fighting, the importance of culture in having influence and cultural understanding, having influence, the kind of post-colonial aftermath of World War II that is really the reverberations of which are still with us today. I think from an American and British perspective, and not to mention Dutch and French and whatever else. So, and of course, the really imperiled and incredibly consequential relationship with China, which I think we tend to overlook, especially in the Europe First policy, which was, I'm not necessarily arguing against it, but I do think it had a consequence in the de-emphasis of China, and thus the loss of influence for the Americans in China, which certainly plays a role in what happens there. And all this is the Army's basically, inextricably involved in all this. So, I as you said, it's a massive story that I needed 3 volumes to tell.
And I think you said the first time you thought it was going to be 2 volumes, but it ended up being 3. Yeah,
exactly. It was just too big for 2 volumes.
When you've reached that point, like our mutual friend James Holland, of where they don't quite put the pressure on your word count anymore. Now it's just like, if he's going to say it's going to be good, if he wants 3 volumes, we'll let him have 3 volumes. And what you said there about the Chinese involvement is really important, because that just wasn't part of the narrative for a long time. And now he's gradually becoming back into the story, which is really good. But let's go through the things I said I'd talk about. So sources, because since your first writing days, the information available has changed beyond recognition, and we've been dealing with COVID and archives being harder to visit, but you must have seen a progression of just what is available and what is available just online sitting in your office. So, what beyond the kind of the famous green books written just after the war, which is where a lot of original histories were kind of coming from, what have you been able to source for these volumes that has changed your perspective, changed your thinking?
Well, a lot of it, but one example I'd give at the top of my head is translated Japanese diaries. I really include the Japanese perspective quite a bit. Certainly, the official sources that survived and were translated or discussed or whatever, but also the individual soldiers' diaries that were kept and then captured by Allied soldiers and translated are incredibly arresting and so powerful, and really gives you the kind of Japanese mindset and insight. And one of the things that really kind of shines through is that the average Japanese soldier, upon embarking in this war, thought of himself as a freedom fighter, liberating Asian peoples from white colonialism. And kind of you see this disillusionment set in over the course of the war, especially in the Philippines for the Japanese, of the locals are not responding to us. We're supposed to be liberators. And yet, of course, we know now the Japanese are really coming as new conquerors, and that's partially why. So, in terms of source material, that was profoundly exciting. But I think I hit the sweet spot in the sense that by the time I attacked this project about a decade ago, you'd had, of course, several decades of, including many, which I was involved in, of preserving World War II veterans accounts.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, by then, even, and certainly now, most of our World War II veterans are gone, which is, profoundly sad from my point of view, having been friends with so many. But so many of their accounts have been preserved, and so many people I'd known and talked to over the years or corresponded with or whatever. And of course, I was getting to this about almost 70 years after the fact, which means that most of the archival sources were available. I was also lucky in that I completed the research well before COVID hit. So I didn't necessarily have to deal with that. And of course, as you mentioned, Paul, we're into the digital age too. So a lot of the digital source material became available as well. What I ended up with is just this massive, enormous trove of primary source stuff. And I'm talking thousands and thousands and thousands of pages and accounts, firsthand accounts and reports and critiques and photographs. And I mean, everything you could imagine to where it would become overwhelming almost. But that's really is where I like to live, because I think that's, what interests me about this is an original story. And that there really wasn't a lot of historiography there. You mentioned the green books. The coolest thing to look at is the material they gathered in the writing of the green books.
Yeah.
A lot of the correspondence that went into that. And that could be really quite illuminating. It's a little, haphazard at times, depending upon who happened to respond to their, to getting an original manuscript and having the time to respond or whatever. But sometimes when they did, it really does alter your understanding of a certain battle or not just the operational side, but like, the engineers or the quartermasters or whatever they're doing.
And is it fair to say that we are, in a sense, in the best period now to be objective about this, in that the classic books that you and I read as kids were maybe written before we were kids, and they were for people who'd survived the war? They'd come back from these units. They didn't want to hear the Japanese point of view particularly. They wanted to be told what they had done was very good and that their leaders were excellent and that you did a good job very well. And they are very important, those books, in our journey to where we are today. But now the audience should want to hear Japanese accounts and Japanese perspectives and the local perspectives as well, because that point you made about the cultural and connecting aspect is so important. Because when we talk about the ETO, and you like me, you love the ETO, you take an average American unit in Normandy, there's going to be Italians, there's going to be German, and someone can communicate somewhere with a local. You go to some of these places in Southeast Asia, there's no one who can communicate. And even from perhaps one side of an island to other, they can't even communicate with each other because of the languages there. And this whole idea as ourselves as the Brits, the British Empire, Malaya and things in the 50s and 60s, the Hearts and Minds campaign of trying to win over the locals, that's something we can look on now and understand the complexity of this. But so the sources, again, you've a raft of sources, even things like Google Earth, so you can actually kind of transport yourself to some of these islands and kind of get a sense of hills and mountains and beaches. And because I think when I did my Iwo Jima week, reading a book about Iwo Jima when I was 12, it sounded like an alien planet. It almost sounded as some kind of where Captain Kirk had been down to. It didn't have any relation to anything I'd grown up and experienced in my life. And now we can understand what these places look like. So, and as we know, understanding terrain is part of the battle in being able to write about a battle, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it creates an intimacy for the reader. And I think that that's especially for readers who have read a lot about whatever battle we happen to be discussing. That creates a freshness to it. I think a better understanding of the terrain. And, the vexing thing is that much of the Pacific terrain, of course, is reclaimed by nature. Not developed as it is in Europe and maybe elsewhere. And so it can be kind of hard to step back into 1944 and get a sense of what the terrain looked like. But I do think that modern tools like Google Earth or whatever certainly give you a layout, and it gives you a sense of scale. It gives you a sense of how small, for instance, Kwajalein Island is. This tiny little brambled place where the 7th Infantry Division is just rooting out the Japanese, piece by piece. And so I think when you sort of look at that, you say, okay, this makes a little more sense to me now, because I think that it's very easy for us as historians just kind of breezily say, why didn't they get that battle done sooner, within a day or something? No, this shows you, the terrain shows you, and then of course the original source material too. You get a sense of these issues that they're dealing with, and the fact that, I don't know, each of these soldiers would like to survive, so you're going to be a little cautious and make sure that each of those logs can be cleared of Japanese as safely as possible. And so the Island Infernos starts there with that particular fight, and so you see initially here are the challenges of island warfare. And then we end with Leyte, which is the big league of this whole thing, a massive battle.
So, your book has come out, rave reviews. For anyone out there who hasn't yet ordered it, bought it from the library, bought a copy, whatever, stupid people who just haven't bought it yet. I don't mean that, folks. But yeah, what are you trying to include in it? Because I'm finding when I go into the Pacific, it's the contextualization that gets tricky, because it's like, well, I ought to mention that. And then you start mentioning Burma. So then you start mentioning, obviously certain islands like the New Guinea campaign, Americans, Australians fighting side by side, but other campaigns, they're separate, but they're not separate. That's the interesting thing. So how do you kind of, in the writing process and the creation process, decide what is worthy to bring in for contextualization? Something like, I don't know, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, or some of the Australian Royal New Zealand Air Force engagements. How do you decide what to put in?
Yeah, good question. And these are tough decisions. These are really tough editorial decisions. I guess the main yardstick I use is, okay, is this part of the story going to give us the ultimate feel for what the Army's war in the Pacific really was? With having a good understanding of what your topic really is, and that we study the U.S. Army in this case, just maybe to have a more profound and contextual and fuller and richer understanding of the American experience against Japan, but the importance of the Pacific War. So I would kind of run it through my mind that way. And there were several battles that I would have liked to have gone into in some more depth, and ones that I did cover that perhaps could have been covered in even more depth. An example would be Lone Tree Hill in Western New Guinea in like May, June 1944, when you've got the 158th Infantry Regiment, or Regimental Combat Team, the Bushmasters, fighting against the Japanese there in this terrible kind of jungle wilderness, and then they're joined by the 6th Infantry Division, and it's incredibly unglamorous. But I think it's really a battle that you could ease into and study in great depth. It just doesn't have the kind of 3 to 5 day quick hit, easy glamour of an island landing in a small place. So, but I also felt it wasn't just about the combat. Whatever would develop the character and the personalities of some of the key people, especially the senior leaders I was covering, whatever would give us a stronger understanding of the logistical challenges, the engineering challenges, the living challenges of operating in this really inhospitable part of the world, whether it's New Guinea or Los Negros or whatever we happen to be talking about, whatever would give us a better understanding, I think, of working with inter-service matters. You're going, from an Army perspective, you're going nowhere without the Navy. And certainly the Pacific War is to a great extent a naval war, but somebody has to fight in the ground too. And so these two become partners, and we kind of see the natural tensions, but we see them work well together too, which I think were good lessons for the future. One of the things I argue in this book too is that Marines and soldiers had much more in common than otherwise. I really think we as historians have kind of misunderstood or exaggerated maybe the supposed differences between the two. Where there was tension, where there was differences, it was usually a leadership matter.
Yeah.
The Marines and soldiers tended to respect one another deeply, and they tended to fight pretty similarly. It was a tendency. I'm not arguing that they didn't necessarily have different doctrine on the drawing board. I'm talking about what they actually did when they were in combat.
Kind of platoon leader and below, you're doing the same job, aren't you? Essentially, there may be decisions being made at a higher level about, as you say, doctrine or grand strategy or basic principles of warfare, but at the lower level, it's the same old crap. And one of the themes that's come up this week with Ben Kite and others is the sense of there's no downtime in the Pacific. In that, if you're an aviator on an American on Guadalcanal, an Australian at Milne Bay, downtime, dysentery doesn't have downtime, malaria doesn't take downtime. You haven't got a pub to go to, you haven't got a girl you can take out and go to the flicks with and watch a movie. And dealing with that, understanding that is part of the understand the soldier's experience, because it's just unrelenting misery, with some of the misery being with bullets flying at you misery, and some of it just being existing day-to-day misery, but it's all misery. And you convey that very well in the first volume. I guess the second volume continues that idea. But there's only so many ways and terms of language where you can say, look, this was a shithole. It's you must have to turn to thesaurus quite frequently to find another way of conveying another Pacific Island hellhole. This one's volcanic, though, this one's slightly more mountainous.
Got more coral.
Hellholes, aren't they?
Yeah, and not wanting to just batter the reader over the head with it. So there's something fresh and new each time. And, really, I think a lot of times the way to get a sense of that is just to look at like the disease rates.
Yeah.
We've got 4 soldiers down with malaria for every one we're losing in combat in New Guinea, so, so then I think it's kind of interesting to look at how they decide to deal with that. What kind of institutional decisions are made. And, of course, the solution ultimately is pharmaceutical, taking atabrine, and there's resistance to it, and all these things we can really relate to nowadays. Like, okay, we have a disease problem, but we also have an information problem as to how we get people to deal with the disease problem, and what kind of decisions we make as leaders or whatever. So, yeah, I think part of that, but you also see, really in spite of the fact that, everything is just inhospitable and not pleasant to fight in, there are variations to it. And one pattern you do see is that as you get farther south to north, jungle warfare starts to give way more so to cave warfare.
Yeah.
And so it's quite interesting, because you see the Japanese sort of adjust to that too, in favor of more like an inland defense and using caves, Peleliu, of course, being a famous example, but lesser appreciated the Battle of Biak in June 1944. And of course, Iwo Jima is the ultimate example. So you do see these little, how geography impacts the pattern of combat, and then the pattern of pretty much everything else. But I also say that the Pacific War is to a great extent an interspecies war, because you are at war with all the critters that are, whether they know it or not, are trying to kill you. The malaria-bearing mosquito, but the scrub typhus that they discover. And, the new brand of scrub typhus that they're having in northern New Guinea, that is a 4% fatality rate. So I think to myself, if they'd fought this war 30 years earlier, 40, 50, everybody would have died. So it shows you, too, that medical science had evolved really dramatically. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Allied armies could proceed as they did. And it's one of the ways the Japanese were declining, especially as we move south to north, too. They were becoming less healthy for the factors, for other factors, the loss of control of the air and the sea, supply issues, but also not as great a, say, malaria discipline or whatever, too. So you see a kind of cultural factor there, too. So all of it is, I think, incredibly fascinating. Beyond just the bullets flying is everything else that goes into what comes into existence in that
Yeah,
area.
and I guess that these places were inhospitable before the Allies and the Japanese got there. But then, in a way, we make it worse because whenever we bugger up nature, nature fights back, don't we? So if we're damaging reefs and we're digging things in and putting airfields in, animals, insects have to move, they have to rehome, they get annoyed. You're essentially kind of poking a metaphorical wasp's nest. And so nature was going to get you anyway, but then you've angered nature by coming into its backyard. And so it's going to fight back and kill you. I mean, just today I was reading about on New Guinea. Is it 97% of Japanese possibly died and were casualties because of non-war things, just starvation, disease, everything else. Even if it's 80%, that is staggering, isn't it?
It is. It's incredible. But I will say this too, it's by design in the sense of, like, for instance, the invasion of Hollandia outflanks many Japanese. So now they're logistically compromised. Now they're going to have to move through the jungle, whereas they wouldn't have before, versus being in the more hospitable coastal areas, maybe. But in the end, that's what claims them. And almost by the design of the Allies, okay, let's let them starve out into this jungle wilderness. They called it a green desert, the Japanese did. There's one Japanese soldier whose account I found, this guy actually survived. I think he was one of 60 out of probably at least 600 to 700 in his unit, who survives the war. Most, are just die out there somewhere in the jungles. And then, you talked about nature pushing back. One way it's pushing back is to basically claim your mortal remains. So, these Japanese soldiers are just getting devoured, by jungle insects and animals of one sort or another. And of course, in the tropics, you can imagine the decomposition. You can imagine the trauma of that too among the Allied soldiers, among those who have been killed or die of disease or whatever. The Allies are much better off, way better off in this regard. So that's partly what's eroding Japanese morale too, such as it is on New Guinea, is that they basically think they're just dying in this terrible godforsaken place. That you're right, it was terrible before we got there, it'll be terrible after we get there, and we make it worse. So it's all of the above.
Well, we had a question about what is scrub typhus and how does it differ from regular typhus? We want to go down a medical rabbit hole there.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you that I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't pretend to know all the vicissitudes of scrub typhus. I do know that it was a deadlier, more contagious version. And there was more known about the standard typhus. Right. And so one of the things that makes scrub typhus more difficult, I have no idea why I called it scrub, so I apologize for that, is just simply that it was unknown, that it was deadlier, more potent. One of the things the best way they deal with it is figure out where it came from. And they find that there were these little mites that were clinging to grass blades. Soldiers were moving through, brushing against the grass blades, getting cut. And of course, you can then see how this proceeds. So that took a lot of course, medical investigation, a lot of case studies, and all done under the duress and stress of soldiers dying, and not knowing which direction that's going to go.
Well, back in Medics Week, how many months ago, I did a show with the US Navy doctor about the improvements. Well, I did two shows that week about the specific improvements that came out of the Pacific campaign, hospital ships getting drugs in there and evacuation and getting people to hospitals close to where they were wounded quickly and all that. I mean, and those are, as you said earlier, your opening kind of speech there about the improvements that we could see going into Korea and going on, is that it's kind of a beginning of a new chapter of warfare. And a couple of people on the comments have already kind of talked about logistics, because that's the other aspect. In your trilogy, I haven't obviously read the third book yet, but it's while you're dealing with landing on islands, you're dealing with this huge tale of logistics that's following everything, and the distances involved are just insane, aren't they? And how much has to go into getting stuff up there and then going back and getting more stuff, and the wastage and things like that. So we can see with the island, we'll bring into island hopping in a minute, but we can see a definite improvement with how the Allies improve amphibious landings, because an amphibious landing is kind of the same each time. Broadly speaking, slightly different beaches configurations. As you said, the terrain you're going to face beyond the beaches changes vastly, and everything you've learned on the previous Solomon's doesn't equate to the Marshalls doesn't equate to, you've got to kind of reinvent the wheel each time. But do you see a definite strides and development being taken in the logistics, or are there kind of peaks and troughs?
All the above, in terms of the planning for amphibious operations. Of course, the shipping available is vital. The more shipping you have available, the more flexibility you have, of course, and the better chance for success, and the better your logistics are going to be. So, of course, as 1944 unfolds, obviously the United States Navy is becoming the most powerful fleet the world has ever seen. But I would argue, too, the United States Army, certainly by the middle and definitely by the end of that year, really is the most proficient amphibious army ever in human history. Because you are carrying out so many landings, you just learn more by doing. Yeah. And so sometimes you land on a beach that's not defended. Sometimes you do. I mean, there's so many landings going on that they're constantly getting these after action reports and learning as they go. And when you look at the planning documents, you do see that a big part of what they're worried about is how they're going to supply once they get ashore, because pretty much everywhere you're going, you have to create your own infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we really tend to overlook that, especially when we're Europe centric, as of course I've been, for much of my career too. Of course we talk about the paucity of ports, in 1944 in France or whatever, but still there are ports available if we can get them.
And roads
and roads and
rail lines and so on and so forth.
Lines of communication, and we don't really have that at Hollandia. So when we landed at Hollandia in April 1944, yes, it's a great coup. You outflank the Japanese, you totally take them by surprise. Their aerial assets are compromised and destroyed in this really quite remarkable operation. They're cut off and outflanked and strangled to some extent, though they're going to react. But now, that's the good news. But now you have to basically create your own port. You got to build your own airfields. You got to build your own roads. You got to stave off disease. And you got to do this in such a manner that we're going to be able to stage, low six-figure number of troops that are then going to be used to invade the Philippines. So all that has to be done within a month or so. And so Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who, carries out this invasion, I mean, really the hard part for him is creating the logistical base. And out of the nothingness. So I think it's quite fascinating for me, especially as I guess you could say a trained American historian, one who's interested in American culture, I suppose, is to see these sort of mini American cities sprout up all over the Pacific in places that no one had ever heard of before, and that many have never heard of since, like Bougainville, like Hollandia, wherever we happen to be talking about. And all of this, of course, was so vital to the Pacific War. And so really, beyond just the naval operations and how the Navy's learned to operate at sea, the Army is having to learn to operate in these various enclaves and bases. And usually this means building key airfield complexes too. So the Army's aviation engineers are something kind of that a one-off for that time, because the Air Force is part of the Army, that you now have ground forces invested to build for air forces that obviously you're not going to have, well after World War II. And that's a lot of your engineering assets.
And with this paradoxical fact that you're getting good at building airfields, but the aircraft that are coming through need bigger airfields with more facilities. So when we talk about B-29s towards the end of the war, compared to, Dauntlesses on Guadalcanal, the needs these aircraft had were exponentially different. So it's not that you're repeating yourself, doing more of what you said you've already done. You're doing more of what you've done, but different and better and grander, and to accommodate more people. And the numbers of people on islands like Saipan and Tinian by the end of the war, it's entirely, like, as you said, it's cities springing up on islands where there were previously dozens of people. I mean, it's just amazing.
It's incredible. And Hollandia is a good example. Hollandia was a nothing wilderness place. 6 weeks later, it's an American city with 100 to 150,000 Americans there. Okay, so think of what that means sewage-wise. Think of what that means in terms of lifestyle and leisure, or aviation operations, the airfields that you're going to have to be operated on, and of course the sea and the wastage, as you mentioned earlier,
and trash, just getting rid of all the detriment of war afterwards. And do you take it away? Do you bury it? Do you burn it? There's so many questions.
I found fascinating reports all about that, detailed like command reports, in which some units would bury the garbage, like the landfill approach. Others would burn it, and of course that would lead to a stench. And could be a security issue because you still got Japanese air raids coming in. And others who had access to watercraft would simply load it aboard barges or whatever and just take it out to sea and just dump it. So all of this is going on, and then they're having to create their own, waste disposal, for the nicest way to put it. So it's a presage of the Vietnam War in that you're building these kind of cut down 50-gallon drums that operate as toilets, and you're building mini latrines that way, and then you're having to burn it. You're burning the offal, and in a tropical environment too. So you can just imagine, like, and I think to circle back to your point earlier, which is a great one, especially like on the aviation side, if you're with the 8th Air Force in East Anglia, it's really, very stressful and deadly, but you do have English pubs, and you might have girlfriends, and you might have
ice cream. Yeah,
exactly. You might have some pretty fun things to do during your downtime. I don't know that you really have that on most of these forlorn places, and that's part of the morale issue. It goes to disease too. Our venereal disease rates in New Guinea are next to non-existent. In Australia, there's some commands that are up to 1/3 or half. So it just shows you the sort of difference there. Not to mention the cultural taboos. And I found that both white and black soldiers uniformly had almost no interest in local women on most of these islands. The exception, of course, being when we get to the Philippines again, and then our VD rates go way back up again. And some other, Guam a little bit, Saipan, but Saipan, you have a completely different civilian environment there. One other thing too I wanted to mention that in this series I push back against a little bit is that one of the things I've noticed, especially you may have too, in our Western sources about the Pacific War, is the tendency to describe indigenous peoples as natives, quote unquote. Whereas, you don't see the description of French people as natives, once you invade Normandy or whatever. And so I think that's a kind of, personally, just my opinion, that's a kind of an imperial holdover, and it's mildly dehumanizing. And
well, I think the first lines in your book are something about the terms we use, and we're not going to say them now. And when you're sifting through those old accounts, especially accounts by veterans, even the veterans we knew, they would use terms, whether it's ETO or Pacific, that we wouldn't use when writing about it, but that's the terms they universally used out there. And I talked with Dr. Carl James about the Kokoda area and the famous Fuzzy Wuzzy poem that Australians written about that, but we wouldn't, and how complex it is to refer to that and say, look, that was a complimentary poem about how brilliant these people were, but we wouldn't now call the poem that, and that's a whole other area to go into. But you've touched on this idea, the supplies, the islands, and the thing I wanted to talk to you about is island hopping, because there's a 2-word expression that everybody watching this will have heard of it. And just to set this up, I don't compare I'm operating in amateur leagues that play on a Sunday afternoon, but compared to Dr. McManus here, but I am doing a bit of writing right now, and I'm finding myself having to explain island hopping. And it seems to me a bit of an oxymoron in that you're explaining the fact that we're trying to avoid landing on heavily fortified islands by landing on heavily fortified islands. And it seems a bit odd but try and take us through in kind of basic terms, given that you've spent so much time researching this, the idea behind island hopping, what was kind of good about it, what was bad about it, and what we know about it today with our 70 plus years of looking back on it.
Yeah, it's sort of the nature of that terrain beast we were just talking about, the vastness of the scale of this. I mean, this is 1/3 of the world's surface of ocean and island and partial continent. So, like I often tell my students, if they had invaded every Japanese controlled island, we'd still be out there. I mean, the war would still be going on. So you had to pick and choose, of course. And I think there's sometimes a kind of a tendency for us to associate island hopping just with Nimitz's Central Pacific Command. MacArthur does much the same thing. So again, it was just kind of the nature of the terrain. So now it's just a question of how you choose your targets, where you're going to invade and where you're not going to invade. And that's a big part of what occupies Pacific theater planning. There's all sorts of invasions on the drawing board. Whether they come off is another issue. And sometimes the toughest decision for any senior commander, whether Nimitz or MacArthur or whoever, is whether to go forward with these invasions. Now, ordinarily, they're going to attempt to choose on sort of two priorities. The reason we're invading an island is almost always we want an airfield there or some kind of base. And it points to the incredible importance of air power, of course, in modern warfare, but especially in the Pacific War, when planes were becoming so deadly to ships. Sometimes we want anchorages that we know are natural harbors that are really good for our naval forces. One of the things that makes a separator for the U.S. Navy versus the Imperial Navy by 1944, though, is that the U.S. naval forces can operate at sea, for more time because they have so much advanced logistics and almost like the naval version of what becomes aerial refueling for aviators in the post-war era. So more commonly it's about capturing an airfield and a staging base from which to project our air power another 500, 1,000 miles or whatever. So then the question is this airfield worth it, considering the level of Japanese fortifications there and how many troops are there or whatever. So now we're in an intel conversation. And that's where there's such a tough aspect to this, because you seldom have in the Pacific War, especially in the South Pacific, good on the ground human intel to give you a sense of how many Japanese are there and how powerful they are. It's usually aerial recon and submarine recon, submarine photos and all that. And sometimes coast watchers who are sort of unsung heroes in this
but
war.
Like one on an island 150 square miles across who's who can't possibly know every bay, every creek, because they're human beings. And I'm with you, an incredibly unsung role there. These Aussies and Dutch and all these people out there who've been in theater for a long time, incredibly important. But when we compare it, as I always do, my default is to compare to Normandy. We think about those tens of thousands of photos that were sent in by British people. So we had a map of the entire map of coast of France, and we had maps, and we had aerial reconnaissance, and we had people who could say, I used to live there. This street does this and goes there. When you talk about the Pacific, all the very tools you were able to bring to this as a historian that we talked about, sources, Google Earth, knowing how many Americans are there, Japanese were there, what the terrain is like, is exactly the same stuff the majority of the American commanders did not have at their fingertips when they were planning these things in 42 and 43.
So they're having to make educated suppositions. It's kind of funny to realize, even in Europe, even in Normandy, where obviously we know all about France, and we've got the French resistance there, and we've got this and that and everything. The soldiers who go ashore at Omaha Beach, the vast majority of them have no idea the existence of elements of the 352nd.
True. Yeah.
So I can imagine in the Pacific somewhere. And so to kind of bump up against that problem, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, the commander of the U.S. 6th Army, in 1944 creates what are called the Alamo Scouts. And the Alamo Scouts are highly selected and well-trained, like individual recon teams that are going to go into various islands and get a sense of the level of Japanese opposition and strength and whatever. But this is always very dicey because it can also tip your hand too. And you don't want to do that in any Pacific island you're invading. So just like you don't want to in Normandy or wherever else. So Kruger always has to make that decision too. Is this worth it or not? Or are these guys going to be too imperiled? One place where you see it really work is at Los Negros and McManus in February 1944. And the significance of this place is it's the Admiralty Islands just north of New Guinea. If you can get a good foothold there in an airfield, as always, you can really accelerate your timetable for advancing across New Guinea. And this is important to MacArthur in 1944 because he wants to get back to the Philippines. And, he's spent the better part almost 2 years in New Guinea, and he's advanced 350 miles, and there's still a long way to go. So the Alamo Scouts, in tandem with aerial recon photos, help MacArthur understand that the Japanese are kind of looking the wrong way, at Los Negros. And so he sends the 1st Cavalry Division in there, elements of it, for a quick landing to try and develop it. And this is really this is one of his better decisions in the Pacific War. It leads to
and thank you for referencing 2 previous World War II TV shows, because we've done 2 on the Alamo Scouts with Lance Zedrick, who's done some incredible work with what they've done. So if you haven't seen those shows, folks, go back and look for Alamo Scouts, and you'll find we've tackled that with some amazing photos, amazing reports, and how brilliant a job they did, and for very, very few casualties as well. It was a force multiplier that cost American very few lives. It was incredibly beneficial. But as you say, we're still only building up a tiny percentage, really, of what we're going to find on these islands. It's a picture we've got of it, but it's a kind of a rough sketch rather than a complete, it
always
full color painting.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the toughest jobs in the world, I think, is to be Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intel chief. He's presiding over this massive intel empire that includes a translator and interpreter section. It includes the recon sections, all of this stuff. And so he's having to provide MacArthur with this information on what kind of Japanese garrison we've got, what kind of weapons they've got, what's their capability, all the usual questions. But it's very difficult to do. Now he's
lots of shrugging. I mean, lots of lots of yes, we don't know. Yeah. And anywhere between this and this, and you could find this, you might find that. It's
I know, and sometimes he does reasonably well. Other times, I think, given all the assets he got, not that well. Biak is a really good example, and they don't have much appreciation for just how potent the Japanese are there, and they're going to have to kind of find out the hard way. And you just see this pattern sometimes in the Pacific War.
Yeah, and this is when you're bringing it back to the island hopping nature. We now only have the route the Allies took to study. We can't study the what if they'd gone that way, what if they'd gone there earlier or they'd gone there later. It's already come up a couple of times in the sidebar about the idea of not going to Peleliu at all and saving all those troops and going to Iwo Jima earlier. And when people outline that alternative history to me, it makes 100% sense to me. I take it on board. But then you're going back and thinking, but what did they know about that? How did what we know happened on Peleliu, how much of that was predictable in advance and how much of it came out of the experience we had there? And that makes it complicated, doesn't it, John? And that's when you're writing these things, because obviously you're thinking, well, I've got to be objective about this. I've got to be fair to these people who are here, but I also, kind of maybe put in the idea that we could have done this and could have done that. And it's an absolute minefield, no pun intended, getting to grips with the Pacific campaign and the complicated nature of it, and which brings us kind of to what we'll move back to the island hopping again, but the hopes you have for this book. I mean, I admit none of us know enough about the Pacific campaign. We know it in broad strokes, and we leap from the big things we know about, and the things in between that we kind of not ignore, but I'll come back to that. So what do you want people to start taking on board when we study the Pacific campaign from the point of view of the U.S. Army?
Well, from the point of view of the U.S. Army, you are seeing an army that's involved in pretty much every aspect of modern warfare, and has become, as I said, the most sophisticated and adept amphibious army of all time. It is an army of extraordinary flexibility, and it's an army so big that no one commander controls it, much as MacArthur would love to. There's army assets, of course, under Nimitz's command, and major army formations, and of course, not to mention what Stilwell's doing in the China-Burma-India theater, and also the aviation side. So, what I really would like us to take from this all these decades later is just the incredible harbingers and similarities you're going to see going forward. The savagery of the combat, the medical challenges, the engineering and logistical challenges, the cultural challenges, working with allies. Even allies as closely aligned as the Americans and Australians, who really get on pretty well, still have issues. And so I think there's good lessons to learn there. And of course, from an Australian point of view, this is really a kind of a seminal moment in Australian history. Because it's when Australia becomes aligned with the United States on a security basis, more so than Britain, begins to really break away from the Commonwealth as its own country. But I think the best lessons can be learned in China, because the alliance with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, as someone who also does research and teaches the Vietnam War, is eerily similar to what you're going to have with the regime in Saigon 20 some odd years later, much less all the other challenges and similarities that we've already discussed. So I think when you look at the Pacific War, you're really looking at a lens to the future. And of course, especially from the Army's point of view, because the Army's dealing with the dirtiest and toughest of the details. I mean, it really is. Naval warfare is naval warfare, and the fleet is of primary importance, and American sea power remains, of course, incredibly important in the 21st century. I'm not going to argue otherwise, but it's really usually not the Navy down and dirty dealing with the insects and with local tribes. Maybe in the Philippines or wherever we happen to be talking about, Burma, I don't know, dealing with the local geopolitical situation in China, dealing with having to take the next ridgeline, the next set of caves, dealing with whatever the enemy has up his sleeve in terms of land warfare that affects sea warfare. So in the Army too, always, I think from a sort of American sociological perspective, tends to be closest to the society because it's the largest. And in World War II, it has the most people drafted into it. And so if we're talking about the Pacific Theater Army, well, it's second only to the European Theater Army, So this is a huge thing, sort of organism that when we get a feel for that, I think not only do we get a feel for World War II, we get a feel for our history ever since. So I really try to create that feel for this is a story of Harbinger that is absolutely relevant today. Yeah. Not unfortunately all too relevant.
And adding to your point there about the Army being the kind of recognizable element of this to the public, and this is nominally part of Aviation Pacific Week. It seems to me the Army Air Corps out there are kind of bridging the gap in a sense, in that they are living on islands with the same conditions of the infantry who are fighting through the engineers. They're not like I'm not saying that the US Navy pilots are having any easier war, but they are in some cases going back to carriers where they're getting, bacon and eggs for breakfast and a nice warm bunk and whatever you need. The guys on the islands are dealing with a very different thing. And yet they're also part of this kind of big strategy of pushing towards Japan because of these gaining airfields and moving on. The range of the aircraft gets greater and greater and greater. So they are instrumental in pushing the Japanese back to the home island. So like the Army is somewhat sidelined in the history by the Marines, do you think the Army Air Corps is somewhat sidelined by the Navy carrier aircraft?
Maybe in a tactical sense.
Yeah.
I think the Battle of Bismarck Sea is a really good example of what the Army Air Forces could do at that point in time to naval, to the enemy's naval forces. And I think, and of course, by the end of the war, as I think there's tremendous tension between the Army Air Forces and the Navy as to who's going to land the knockout blow against Japan and what they're going to do next and all this. And of course, we know that on the Air Force side, there is this sort of strategic bomber cult that believes that air power now is the new weapon of war and is the main way wars are going to be fought. And of course, I call them, like air power evangelists. Because they wanted their independence from the Army, quite understandably and rightfully. Yeah. And they did possess pretty powerful weapons, such as an atomic bomb, by the end of the war.
Yeah, which we talked about on Monday, which seems an eternity ago now. But yeah, right. So incredibly important in the ending of the war. But another thing I promised I would ask, I just remembered it, and I didn't say it to you in an email, but I thought about it now, is I did Australia in World War II week 2 or 3 weeks ago. And one show was on the Australians in the Mediterranean. The other 4 were all about the Pacific. So we did a show with Michael Veitch about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and Mark Johnston talked about the 9th Infantry. And all 4, Philip Bradley talked about the landings in Leh, who'd done a Shaggy Ridge show earlier. All 4 talked about MacArthur essentially sidelining the Australians for the last chapter. Now I know most of that's kind of that kind of bridges volume 2, and I guess kind of volume 3 will cover a bit of that as well. But asking the American here, so I don't want to put you on the spot there. They were very diplomatic when they said it, these 4 Australians, but they all, writing on behalf of that nation, felt that being sidelined, having been so influential. We talked about Milne Bay. We talk about some of those epics down Kokoda, Boona and Gona, which you talked about with us before. What's your feeling about the MacArthur kind of putting the Australians kind of I'm not going to say into reserve because that implied they didn't see combat, because they were still seeing some pretty shitty things there at the end. But the Australian Air Force, particularly, which we talked about with Ben Kite 2 days ago, they definitely, I think one of the squadrons in the last 4 months of the war had like 3 kills because there just was nobody in the air. They were flying off in places where the Japanese weren't. So what's your feeling?
My feeling, I guess if I could sum it up at a quick intro point that I'd expand on a little bit. In one sense, he's disrespecting them. In one sense, he's doing them a favor. 1942 and 1943, the Australians are the lead actors in some ways in this alliance, especially in terms of the ground fighting. Australia is so profoundly important to what the Allies are hoping to achieve in the Pacific, and especially the U.S. Army. 1 million Americans passed through Australia at some point during the war or are based there. Australia contributes per capita more people in uniform than I think any other country on the planet in World War II. They're feeding our army to the tune of 40 to 50% in 1942 and 1943, and still the Americans are moaning about it and complaining, and so to the point where now we have to get more food imported from the U.S., which occupies more shipping. And yet I think MacArthur, though he appreciated this, I think felt that that now once he was built up with American forces by 1944, that these ought to take the lead, that he had always wanted to command Americans more than Australians, that initially when he took over in 1942, he allowed all sorts of counterproductive, toxic language to go back and forth, including from him, disrespecting the Australians, which I really have a problem with all these decades. It's one of the things when I look at it later, I just shake my head and say, this is just really a bad thing. So I have this point in Island Infernos where MacArthur, it's really quite fascinating. Before he goes up to the invasion of Leyte, he meets with Prime Minister Curtin. And Prime Minister Curtin, the Australian Prime Minister, is a dying man at that point. And they kind of both know it. And I think there's something kind of symbolic there, that it's going to be their last meeting, that MacArthur has no more use for the Australians in a sense, that he's kind of casting away a very good and important friend. And both of them have this kind of bittersweet sadness about it. But I want to say, too, given what's about to happen in terms of some of the battles that are going to be fought as we go farther north, Biak, Peleliu, Angar, Leyte, and not to mention, of course, once we're into Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the Australians should count their lucky stars that they're not part of that nightmare. When they had sacrificed enough, they had done an enormous service to the Allied side in this war. And these were manpower-intensive battles, comparable to what was happening in the European theater by the fall of 1944 and into 1945, when you're seeing British manpower just drained into nothingness, Canadian manpower, that it really was time for the Americans to kind of take the sort of bullet, for lack of a better way to put it. I
think that's a really valid point, and you explain it very articulately. I can't even say the word articulately, ironically there, but there's a that's weird. Anyway, but the Australians, I think, would agree with you. The historians I had on, but they'd say, but it would have been nice to have been asked. Kind of, it'd been nice to say, you can sit this out, but if you want to come with us all the way, now you've got us. You've helped get us to this point. If you want to ride the train it's going to be a crappy journey, but if you want to come with us, we'd like you beside us. I think that's how they feel about it.
I don't blame them.
More Australians would have been lost if they'd carried on. But the sense of watching the conclusion without you being there, I think would have, well, not I think, the four Australian historians told me that the people they wrote about definitely felt silent. And there was, there were mutiny. There was a mutiny within the American Air Force at this point. It got big. It got quite big at this point about what are we being used for, who is doing it, and as you said, the tensions. People talk about tensions in the ETO, and they talk about Sicily and Patton and Monty and all that. There are some pretty monumental tensions out in the Pacific, isn't it? Which, of course, you touch on, because there are some monumental egos out there. MacArthur, Mountbatten, Nimitz, Howells. I mean, there's some Australia did 3 prime ministers during the course of the war. I think, wasn't it 3 by the end of the year? So, extraordinary personalities out there. So, That's another thing. Going back to the historiography angle of this book, is that those types of figures, MacArthur and others, have gone over the years through peaks of troughs of the public thinking they're great, to the public thinking they're awful, to the public thinking, well, they're okay, and then back to great again. In your opinion, broadly speaking, where are we now with MacArthur and some of these other figures? Have we kind of understood it now, and we kind of say he's there? So can we put him at a level, for example?
I think we're at a very mature place with MacArthur.
Blamey. Someone just said Blamey as well. Yeah.
Blamey too, right?
Yeah.
And MacArthur certainly had his moments of disrespect for Blamey. Absolutely. And one thing I want to mention before I forget too, before I go on to MacArthur, I think in the invasion of Japan and the plans that were on the drawing board, there was going to be at least one Australian division. So I guess they were going to be allowed to participate in that nightmare. I'm just glad they didn't, and no one did. But yeah, so MacArthur, I think we're in a mature place in the sense that we had this cult of personality and kind of hero worship that prevailed among a significant part of the American public for a decade to a decade and a half after World War II. And a lot of that was political, to be honest, because he was so heavily associated with Republican circles and opposition for FDR and opposition for Truman's Korean War policies and all these kinds of things. But you still see this survive. And my parents are a good example of this into, say even the 70s and 80s, as some people who would say, they should have listened to General MacArthur. They should have done what he wanted in Korea. They should have, we wouldn't have to deal with Red China now. And I remember being raised on tales of that. And it's been quite interesting in the decades since, when I kind of know more of the truth about all of this, to tell my parents, no, not so much. And so I think this is a microcosm, because I think that the majority of the American public understand what an egomaniac MacArthur was in so many ways, and how troubling a figure he was, while still respecting his service and his obvious intellect and his courage. Yeah. I think we realize too that there's a limit to his effectiveness, and so I do think that now, all these decades later, there's less emotion involved in it. None of us knew MacArthur. None of us really have that tie, or that base point of that tie to the political battles of the 1950s or something. We're way beyond that. So I think we have a perhaps mature view. Nimitz, I would argue, is still overlooked and not appreciated enough by the average American. My friend Craig Simons is about to publish a new biography of him, which I think
I'll have to have him on the show then. Yeah, well, good. Yeah,
absolutely should, because here is a first-class naval historian bringing to light this incredibly significant personality. So I think, even after Craig, I would be surprised if there's not more to say and do about Nimitz, because I just think his importance is.
I'm writing that down on a post-it so I don't forget.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of those two sort of premier American figures, I think we know plenty about MacArthur, and we know what he was about. Nimitz, I think there's still a lot more work to do.
Which brings us in some ways back to this idea of we're in a really good place now. We've got those veterans' testimonies. We met some of the veterans. We've got all that to draw on. We've got the internet resources and the digitalized archives, and yet we've also got this 7-decade historiography we can look back on and go, well, that era was when they thought that. And have we got through that now? Are we at a point where we can take everything on objectively without people going, no, how dare you say this about someone I like or hate, depending on people's point of view? But I want to take it back, because we've got a question to the island hopping campaign, and this one struck out on the sidebar. And thank you, everybody, for joining in there. And we can't always acknowledge all your comments there. Peter O'Connell says, given Japanese outposts near hopeless logistical situation, could more of these, going back to the islands, e.g. the Gilberts, have been hopped over? So that's kind of a what-if scenario. But what's your feeling on a bit more hopping, less invasions?
Probably so. But I think a lot of that is predicated on what on intel.
Yeah.
On knowing that if we bypass the Gilberts, that they're not going to cause us problems, that's not going to be exposed flank with a Japanese airfield that'll mess with U.S. shipping and whatever else. That to me is just the essential core of this war. It comes down, like any war, to good intel. And if you don't have it, you're going to be in some trouble. And I think, I always tend to come down on the side of there should be more hopping and less island invading and all that. And it's one of the things that I really attempt to cover in this book and the whole series is, what battles were necessary, what were not. And the way the battle is fought, is this tactical engagement necessary? Example would be the lesser known adjunct to Peleliu, the invasion of Angar, which comes off partially through a miscommunication and through the sort of narrow-mindedness of General Rupertus, the 1st Marine Division commander, who just simply hated the army and didn't want him involved. So they end up invading Angar, and okay, they get a little airfield there and whatever, but they then go in to this really kind of very problematic area and terrain where the Japanese could make ideal defenses, and they just decide they're going to fight them to the last step of this thing. And, you lose something in the order of about 200 guys killed. And that may not seem a lot all these decades later, but that's a heck of a price to pay for this horrible little coral phosphate spot there. And so it's a microcosm for what happens in Peleliu. It's a microcosm for what happens on some of the other islands too. I think much the same mistakes are made at times in Saipan, a much bigger battle. And so it's not just the island hopping, it's which parts of these islands are we going to take and which not. The Americans, I think, get it right at Bougainville. And here's Bougainville is a classic example of what I'm talking about and why I wrote this series. If I mention Bougainville to the average person who may have heard it, and there aren't that many, they would associate that with, the 3rd Marine Division went ashore and they took Bougainville. Okay, well, yes, the 3rd Marine Division did go ashore, created an American enclave there, fought hard, fought well as usual. But then you had multiple Army divisions come in and hold the perimeter they created. You had airfields built that were vital. You have this big island, and you've got an enclave in the island, and then the Japanese decide to come to you and attack your heavily fortified perimeter, which is like an American fortification and city. And you see this in March 1944, and it is an incredibly violent battle. Yeah. It's so devastating for the Japanese. So they're defeated roundly, but the Americans make the smart choice not to go after them and try and capture the whole island. And then once you have this American city that's a base, and then the war moves north and it becomes a backwater. And guess who gets the job of
it's the Aussies come in again. Yeah, we did a whole show on it 2 weeks ago. Yeah,
unglamorous morass.
And yeah, Bougainville is
right there.
Is fascinating because it's kind of against the run of play, isn't it? Because it's the Japanese have been kind of on the defensive and they kind of get all aggressive there again in a kind of an almost 1941-42 kind of way against the run of play. And it's an incredible micro study of a unique campaign within a series of campaigns that do have similarities from one to the other. It's a real odd one in the mix there. And bringing it back to the island hopping. Because, you made that very, very important point about can we build an airfield there? And we talked about the fact that by the end of the war, we have the B-29, the most expensive military program the Americans developed in World War II, as I understand it, But if you're if you're in the Army Air Corps in 1940 in a P-40 or something like that, or you're in a B-17C or whatever it is, or you're an Aussie in one of their rather not so good aircraft, to be able to envisage the B-29 just 2 and a bit years later, effectively, it would have been like someone showing you something from a science fiction book of the future, wasn't it? I mean, we take it for granted that we went from this progression from, we talk about it all the time. I mean, the British Royal Air Force was 35% biplanes in 1939, and by 46 we had jets. That 6 years showed improvement on a scale the world would never see again. And given this is aviation in the Pacific week, the commanders couldn't have seen the progression of what air power can do, which means we can now question some of the island hopping, because we were considering it within the ranges of the 42 aircraft. But of course, we then have aircraft later that can do way more than what the 42 aircraft was. So again, it's all Monday morning quarterbacking to some extent. And we can look at this and say, maybe we didn't need to do that one.
Yeah, we basically have our 2 kinds of airfields in this war. We have our fixed airfields that are islands and land and whatever, where we build the actual airfields, and we've got aircraft carriers. The second of which are, of course, always vulnerable, especially the closer they are to land. As this thing evolves even more, we now have heavier bombers and more range and more ability to drop bombs a little bit more accurately, as things go, mainly from experience, I think.
Yeah.
And to deal with weather and all those kinds of things. So air power was getting deadlier. And it was getting deadlier on a couple levels. The amount of firepower, which eventually becomes nuclear, of course, but also in the potency of the use of air power, as the Japanese will prove in kamikaze air power. Which, I mentioned earlier, and I want to you know, I mean, of course, I didn't want to disrespect the naval side of the war at all, because it's pretty hard business when you're aboard a ship dealing with torpedoes coming at you and all these other terrifying things. You know, the Army doesn't have to really deal with kamikazes the way the Navy does. That's really the Navy's problem in a way. And you talked about long-term lessons. I know of no fail-safe defense for a suicide bomber to this day. So this just happens to be Japanese in planes. Later on, we're talking about people in vehicles or with vests or whatever, you know, so, you know, not in World War II, but I'm saying in the 21st century. So yeah, you've got all of these other issues, and not to mention, we're talking about logistics and engineering. Okay, so imagine you're supporting a B-25 squadron at an airfield in New Guinea or something. I mean, that's one animal, and it's quite another animal, a B-29 squadron in the Marianas later on, and everything it takes to operate. You know, of course, you need different soil composition to have a better support for these heavier planes. You need longer runways. You need more hangars. You need more grounds crew. I mean, this becomes
and the maintenance and
the
sheer amount of supplies you need to keep just even one B-29 in the air, let alone squadrons and squadrons of them. It's unbelievable. The development, and you know, the fact we just mentioned the Navy there. You know, we talked about the Dauntlesses yesterday with Donald Nybor, and the point you're making over your trilogy of books is the Army's casualties are coming every day, continuously, over weeks, months, and years. Whereas a Navy ship goes down, especially if it's a carrier, that's a lot of people lost in a matter of seconds and minutes. And that's the sort of fundamental difference between the Army's drawn out campaign and the Navy's suddenness, you know, and you know, Midway, where 4 carriers in a matter of minutes really lost. Those kind of moments don't happen in ground assaults over islands. It's you measure those gains over weeks and months and years, and the scales of comparison are very different. The rules by which we judge the successes are so fundamentally different, and it's why I guess we're into a 3-volume trilogy to do it, because island after island, every one with its own set of problems.
Absolutely, everyone. I mean, Savo Island is another example of what you're talking about on the naval side. 4 cruisers go down, and just think of the loss of life there. And so, you know, in Army ground combat, typically, you know, maybe there's 3 guys wounded for every 1 who's killed, you know, due to enemy fire and disease aside. You know, that's generally the rhythm of how this works. If it becomes flip-flop, then you know you're in a really especially terrible battle, and usually a defensive battle of one sort or another. You know, so yeah, I mean, but as we, you know, get to the bottom line of it all, it tends to be deadlier and more casualty intensive to fight on the ground. You know, fortunately, though, those big disasters, naval disasters, don't happen all that often, at least for the U.S. side, the Allied side. It does a little bit more for the Japanese side as we progress in the war. But yeah, I mean, it's such a stunning thing. This isn't really covered all that much in this volume for obvious reasons, but once the kamikazes come into play, it's such a stunning thing for the Navy to deal with, especially in the Battle of Okinawa. You know, so you have this sort of arc. The Battle of Guadalcanal and the Battle of Okinawa are the 2 deadliest in the history of the U.S. Navy. Guadalcanal, mainly because you're dealing with a very potent Japanese fleet, a lot of surface engagements, and of course, Savo Island has put a big bite. Okinawa, the kamikazes. In ground combat, it is what it is throughout the whole thing. And if I could identify a pattern for you that holds for most of the war, it's that the Japanese are going to be much more potent on defense, much better fighters, partially because most of them will fight to the death. And obviously the defender always has the advantage in any kind of combat. And they have a pretty decent amount of infantry firepower and otherwise to inflict casualties. Fortunately, their artillery is not all that advanced, and especially maybe not until Okinawa or so. On offense, it's another matter. They do not have a good grasp of combined arms assaults, and their idea of an assault usually is what we think of as a banzai attack or whatever. And this is terrifying to deal with, but it's profoundly wasteful, and it plays into the 2 American strengths, which is firepower and valor. and so
yeah.
you're going to see this play out. And so it's tougher for you as a soldier to say, okay, you're going to have to deal with a Banzai assault tonight. That you may be more terrified of that than if I'm going to send you in to deal with caves tomorrow or something. But statistically speaking, you're probably better off dealing with the Banzai assault. The best example of that is Saipan, in July 1944.
And that's another interesting, you said about these Japanese diaries and Japanese accounts that you had translated and you can access now. I think all of us, when we think about the Pacific Theater, you said it yourself, we divide the Japanese tactics into two types, the Banzai charge and the kind of hiding in caves with booby traps. And that's it. They're the two types we think of. And yet we know we allies have all sorts of flanking maneuvers and firepower and complex ways of dealing with enemy that we can put into force, and the Japanese we've rather just dismissed with these two types. And it is about time to put back the Japanese story into this and say that they did do some pretty good defensive jobs on some of these islands, going way beyond what their resources should have allowed them. They didn't have the infrastructure the US have behind. They were supplying what if they could get supplies with submarines. They're having to grow their own food in New Guinea because there's nothing else to eat, and yet they were able to put up these in some cases incredibly valiant, gallant, and well coordinated defenses. So that's obviously something that's been very refreshing for you to study and better put that story back in there so we can understand it.
I wanted to bring that to life. I mean, because if you're a Japanese commander, especially by mid-1944, when U.S. submarines are just completely beginning to strangle the Japanese merchant fleet and all this, you can probably expect to lose about 1/10 to maybe 15 to 20% of your forces degraded because of troop ships sunk by United States submarines. So you're losing people, you're losing combat effectiveness among the people who do survive, you're losing weapons, you're losing building materials that would help you fortify, and yet they're still able to fortify and defend, and do very, very well in pretty much every 1944 battle from post Los Negros. So Major Goto at Angar, which is not popularly remembered at all, puts on a little mini clinic in this small fight against the 81st Infantry Division, a very good unit, but they're in the middle of this morass fighting against heavy Japanese defenders in this terrible area. And that's what I mentioned, they're going to lose a couple hundred guys killed. And Colonel Nakagawa at Peleliu does that on a much larger scale in using, of course, the caves. And then you're going to kind of see this pattern begin to replicate itself. The tension in the Imperial Japanese Army, defend at the waterline and repel them, or defend inland and bleed them. Well, once you started to lose control of the sea and the air, which obviously they have, you're probably not going to push them into the sea. And so the Japanese are going to have to learn this themselves as 1944 unfolds. And you're seeing them learn it under duress at Biak. And then this has reverberations later for the way, they're going to, sort of misdefend at, I would argue, at both Saipan and Guam. And then, of course, by the time of Peleliu and Angar, and obviously Leyte, and later on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, you see it all come to fruition. And so in terms of defensive warfare, it's something of a masterpiece in a way if we're talking about the strategic object of bleeding the Americans, which I would argue is the Japanese best hope by this time period of mid to late 1944, post Marianas. The Marianas, to me, are to the Pacific War what Normandy is to the European War, the pivot point. Once the Germans lose at Normandy, they're probably going to lose the war. But it's a question of how much bleeding there's going to be and how traumatic and who's going to do what, all the other political ramifications. So, too, here, once the Japanese lose those inner defenses in Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, now that is a political game changer, changes the Japanese government, though not enough to end the war. But it also creates air bases from the Americans from which to bring, war to the home islands, the bombing of Japan. And that is for sure game changer. So what you've got on the plate for you as a Japanese strategist at that point is to try and bleed them so much that they're not going to want to see this thing through to unconditional surrender.
And just the fact you said they're Japanese strategist, I think a lot of us have come in to understand the Pacific thinking there is no such thing as a Japanese strategist. We think of Yamamoto and planning Pearl Harbor, and then we just think kind of 42 onwards, it's just desperate
They're constantly
stands
strategizing.
for islands, but actually they're
Yes.
getting things wrong, but they are trying
Mhm.
to learn lessons. They're trying to say, what did we
Oh,
do
yeah.
wrong on this island? How can we do it better here? And again, putting that back into the story is really important. But a really good question that I want to address, and then perhaps we'll wind things up from the Great Dominion there.
Mm.
It's about the comments about the US Army use of
Oh, yeah.
tanks in the Pacific, but perhaps we can widen that out to tanks and the kind of mechanized element of things,
Mhm.
because again, when we talk ETO, we are talking about a US Army that by 43, 44, everything's brought up by truck, tanks, armored cars, cavalry, armored units, reconnaissance. You've got lots of everything there to
Mhm.
transport and put that fight. The Pacific is very different. And we have this image we've talked about of the ragged GI or Marine running across beaches, but we have got armor out there. So
Oh, yeah.
I know it's a big subject, but kind of, and then I know you tack it in the books, but any kind of broad
Mhm.
sweeping statements you can say about armor in
Sure.
the Pacific?
Absolutely. It's a great subject and a great question, because armor is a key component of all these battles we've been talking about. And, we tend to kind of overlook that because you don't see actual bona fide armored divisions deployed to the
Yeah.
Pacific the way you do in Europe for obvious reasons. But in all these battles, U.S. commanders especially are using tanks in a very adept combined arms way with the infantry, and they're finding ways to use tanks in what are pretty problematic battlefields, a heavy jungle, muddy terrain and ridge lines, cave warfare. Of course, by then the armor is just imperative to use in cave warfare, and so the armored formations are getting bigger. What you're tending to see in the Pacific is individual tank battalions deployed with infantry regiments or infantry divisions, depending upon how many you've got and what your shipping is and all that. And then you're working them in very close combined arms teams. That are working together, whether it's at Biak, whether it's on Peleliu, whether it's on Guam, Saipan, Leyte. You see a lot of tanks on Leyte, and so as the war matures and the formations get bigger, you see more and more tanks in. By the time we invade Luzon in January 1945, you've got the equivalent about a division of armor ashore. It's just not called an armored division. It's like an armored task group of one sort, and because they want that independence to parcel it out. It's the tankers' worst nightmare pre-World War II. Tankers were sort of like the ground version of the aerial evangelists. Tank warfare is the new thing. We're going to be the lead actors in the next war. We're going to fight big tank battles. We're going to have deep penetration in the enemy's rear and all this kind of stuff. And not that doesn't happen, but that's a bit of an oversell in my view. And I fully concede that I'm an infantry historian and I'm infantry centric in that regard. But in reality, it's usually not a tank to tank thing like in the movie Fury or whatever. It's usually a very unglamorous slog with the tanks and infantry working together in some kind of terrain, where we figure out how to do that. And the Pacific is really no different. Just you do not see divisional formations. Biggest problem you have as a tanker is not enemy tanks. The Japanese tanks are no match for you, and even if you encounter one, you're probably going to destroy it if you're in a Sherman, as most tankers are. Anti-tank pieces, which are very cleverly camouflaged and concealed and crewed on many of these battlefields, and eventually suicide attackers. Who are coming out of the caves or coming out of jungle holes or whatever, and are getting in close and are trying to destroy your tank that way. And that's terrifying. And so it also places a premium on working very closely with the infantry and sometimes the engineers. And so just like in Europe, you start to see the two sides learning to communicate better because they didn't have the same radio frequencies, same problem in Europe. And so they're rigging up phones on the back of tanks and all that kind of stuff too. So you're seeing a lot of these sort of same patterns, just maybe on a smaller scale and a little bit different terrain. By the time we get to Manila, by the way, too, in urban combat in 1945, you see tanks used much the same way you would in the Battle of Aachen. In October 1944.
It's funny to say that because I was literally watching some footage of tanks in Manila, and I thought that looks exactly like footage. I think it was Cologne I saw it, but it looked exactly the same. You could just kind of take out a couple of palm trees and put in a couple of German mailboxes, and it would have been exactly the same thing. I was really quite astonished by that. But yeah, no, you're right on that. But what you said there about working together in these small task forces, this brings it back to your point about the lessons that were carried forward from the Pacific campaign, because even the kamikaze idea, I mean, I hope I'm not getting it wrong, but didn't JFK say that no one can defend themselves, anybody who's willing to die for a cause? And that's
right.
That's essentially a kamikaze, isn't it? Which brings us into the modern wars, and we're not going to go down a big hole of talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, but suicide bombers, people are prepared to give their life. This is something that the American Army and Marines experienced and learned to deal with, not just in a pure military way, but dealing with it psychologically. I think in many ways, dealing with kamikazes is a psychological hurdle.
For sure.
In some way, the intense fear of, we're on this massive, great ship with shitloads of guns, and one idiot can kind of come in and kill us all. Terrifying. And the same on these islands here. So and this idea of combining armor and infantry engineers, because that's in a sense your kind of modern task forces. That's your modern armies are smaller now that we don't send entire divisions in, because we do sometimes, but we don't have theaters of, it's not the Russian front where they send 180 divisions out before breakfast. It's task forces of small units working together. So do you think the military of different countries are using lessons from the Pacific enough to understand modern warfare? I obviously see staff rides coming to Norway because that's where I live, but are people going out to the Pacific? Obviously, it's harder to get out there, but are we learning lessons? Or are the modern military learning from this?
Oh, I think so. On the American military side, if not always on-site staff rides, study of these battles. And it tends to be the bigger battles. It tends to be Saipan. It tends to be Okinawa, Iwo Jima. I think there's not enough study of the Philippines campaign in 1944 and 45, whether we're talking about us as historians or the military folks. This is really the nexus of the American war in the Pacific. We fight two major campaigns in the Philippines. A major chunk of our casualties are in the Philippines. The Philippines is the sort of crux of the American position in the Pacific. And there's all kinds of different fighting, from amphibious assaults. Eichelberger's 8th Army carries out 35 amphibious assaults in like a 2-month period or 3-month period in 1945. There's jungle fighting, there's cave fighting, there's urban combat in Manila. And so I think there's much to learn there. But I do think that on the military side of the sort of staff study or staff ride house, there tends to be study of the bigger, more prominent battles.
Yeah.
And I understand why.
And you make a good point there about what happened in Manila, because, again, some of those events were somewhat overshadowed by the dropping of the atomic bombs, which became the big news story, and the loss of life. We had James M. Scott on a few weeks ago talking about Manila and the 100,000 civilians killed. And when we talk about MacArthur, a couple of people made a side, but ask anybody from the Philippines what they think of MacArthur, and they'll definitely have an opinion, won't they? They won't be on the fence about that one if they understand their history. So, it's the island hopping campaign is concluded in a sense in the shadow of this awesome power that the Americans and the Allies inflicted upon the mainland Japan, which we talk about the Australians being sidelined by MacArthur. The whole island hopping campaign, in a sense, was sidelined by the Enola Gay and that aspect of it, which is the culmination of the Pacific campaign, which is interesting, and it's and thank God we didn't go invade Japan over land, and the loss of life there would have made some of these earlier campaigns, I think, look like walks in the park. No disrespect those who lost in the earlier islands, but that would have just been a monumental conflict. May have still been going on, possibly. Yeah, I don't know.
It would have been horrible. I mean, Kruger's 6th Army alone was going to be expected to take Kyushu, and they were probably going to be outnumbered by the Japanese on the island by the time the invasion would have happened in November 45. Eichelberger's 8th Army and then the 10th Army were going to invade, the Honshu Plains there near Tokyo in Operation Cornet. This would have been easily the biggest amphibious assault in history. Fortunately, that from a Japanese perspective too, fortunately it happened the way it did. We talked about controversies that immediately get people emotional. That's one of them, the atomic bomb. And I've never quite understood the point, in the sense that really it's the Japanese who are helped too, absent those who were unfortunate enough to be under those bombs, horrible though they were. when you're talking about a ground invasion of millions of people potentially dying on both sides, that's a different element. And
I
when
think
you look at the
for me,
scholarship, there's not much question that the bomb isn't dropped just to cow the Russians or whatever. It's really much more layered than that. So,
it's a difficulty to me of trying to wear two hats at the same time. You're trying to wear your analytical hat and your emotional hat, and whichever one you've got on, you see it through that lens. So when you're looking at it purely practically from a military level, it seems completely necessary. Then you put your emotional hat on and look at some of those photos of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and you can't help but kind of start, your moral compass starts going all around the 360, and you can't. It just,
but that's
it
where
just
you
does
are by
something
the
to your
end. I
soul,
know.
doesn't it? It does something.
It's horrible, and that's how horrible this war has become. And it's earned the sheer loss of life. What had led to this, the firebombing campaign, was even worse in terms of initial loss of life. So you'd already basically taken all the gloves off with this massive firebombing campaign. You were blockading and mining and raiding against Japan, and had strangled it too in terms of the submarines destroying the merchant fleet and this invasion force, staging. And so it's I think a really a sad byproduct of what the war had become by 1945, how deadly it had really become. And Okinawa had presaged that too, because it's deadly in a way to the Okinawans as much as the two primary combatants. And so part of what I'll cover that in the next volume, but what I hope to convey in this volume and the previous one, Fire and Fortitude, is the sort of human face for the Japanese too. These guys are fighting on the Japanese side. We're not always these robotic automatons or whatever, that they were young men with futures ahead of them and hope to have long lives. And they were people who, just like on the American or Australian side, had cultural pressures and expectations and family pressures. And of course, different from a Western versus Japanese perspective, but still, these weren't guys who really wanted to die. It's kind of what was expected of them. And
we paint them with a broad brush, don't we? We definitely look at them through one point of view. And but to bring things to an end, you still talk about the third volume there. Is it halfway through, beginning it, near the end, finished, in the can? Where are we with it?
It's mostly done. Because it was going to be this one in the same book, 44 and 45. So most of what I've written for 45 is done. It just needs to be kind of staged with a new introduction and maybe a little bit more thinking in terms of the kind of larger perspective of the whole thing. But yeah, the hardest part I think is done, hopefully.
Good. And will you, but assuming you return to the ETO for some future writing, like me, part of your heart is there, in my case, because I live there. But the Eastern Front most completely is not included in this. There's some nicety, broadly speaking, about the western part of the Normandy, Germany, Italy campaign that you don't see in the Pacific. So will it not, I'm not being going to say anticlimactic going back to the ETO, but will it feel a little bit kind of easier on the soul, in a sense, because of just the brutality that we talked about when you're dealing with the Pacific? The ETO doesn't have that overwhelming, horrific nature.
It really doesn't. No, I think it probably will. It's a good question and insight, both. I think it will, because this is the ultimate savagery of warfare in so many ways. And it's not the prettiness of the greatest generation and all this kind of stuff. It's terrible.
There's no French girls coming out giving kisses and it's a different end, isn't it?
Well, and this is what I've come to believe, and this is only my opinion after studying this a while. I don't think too many of us would dispute that the war in Europe had to be fought. Hitlerism had to be stopped. All of that just could not continue. I've really come to believe that this war between the U.S. and Japan did not necessarily have to be fought. I understand why it was, really, on both sides. But it's part of what I think is the epic and fundamental tragedy of this whole thing, is you see these young men on both sides caught in the middle of this horrible, savage war. That I don't know that it needed to be fought. I think the U.S. and Japan actually got on very, very well, for the most part, before it and after it, with this big hiccup. It's a biggie. But it's amazing to me how quickly the two countries became friends shortly after World War II, and partially because of the Cold War, of course. But I think the U.S. occupation of Japan, similar to the one of Germany, in some ways liberates your opponents too. and in some ways. And so, I think if Japan had been less militaristic, aggressive, less in this mindset of this sort of nihilistic mindset of, oh, we must have these resources and conquer them or we're done. I think if perhaps the West would have been pulling back from its open door colonialism, a lot of big ifs, of course, but I guess I've just come to believe that this war was not quite as necessary as the one in Europe. And I'm not saying I'm totally against it. I'm just saying perhaps there would have been a way to avoid it.
Wow, that's a wonderful and interesting point to finish on. And I think as we're getting older, you kind of get a bit more, you get less excited by the equipment and the tanks and the firepower, and you get more reflective. You kind of own mortality starts not staring in the face. We're not quite there yet, but you do start getting more reflective and thinking in a worldly wise way. I certainly find that myself. And the way I looked at World War II when I was in my 20s is very different to how I'm now in my 50s. But it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, John. I will just remind people what we got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second, so don't go away. But folks, nothing tomorrow. I've got a day off. Actually, I'm going out filming with JD from History Underground, who's watching right now. And then Monday, got a little bonus show. Tessa Dunlop is coming on the afternoon, 4 p.m. UK time, to talk about her book, Army Girls, about the last surviving ATS veterans who who participated in the war effort for the British in khaki, but they were women. And then in the evening, we start our Italy in World War II week with 5 amazing shows. So as usual, don't forget to follow what we're doing on social media. Please consider becoming a patron and support me into the future so I can keep on bringing these shows. The links, as I said at the beginning, I'll remind you, to John's books are in the description below, as is the link to his website. Incredible back catalogue of works there with John. It's like going back into the Beatles back catalogue. You think you found your favorite album, then you find another one that you like even more. So, and I think it won't be too long before John comes back and does appearance number 8. So when book number 3 is coming up, you'll be welcome to come back. But right now, thank you very much for joining us, John. Did you enjoy the chat?
I have more than enjoyed it. It was awesome.
Good. It's wonderful talking to you. So, folks, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. I will see you all again on Monday. Thank you very, very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Cheers, everybody. Thank you very much again.